Okay, so this is a conversation about climate action in Vermont, and it's a specific kind of conversation around climate action in Vermont because it's about an opportunity that Vermont has to access a whole other set of federal funds. In this opportunity of putting together a priority list of measures and actions that Vermont would want to seek funding for is a great chance to check in with a range of Vermonters about priorities. And that's what this call is about and what we've been doing in the last couple of days on this as well, and what you'll see us continue to do over the upcoming months. Before Jane Lazorchak and Megan O'Toole and Sophie Veltrop, who are all here from the Climate Action Office, before they give us this overview, I want to just pause to say who's in the room here. And what we did last night, which was great, was if in the chat, if you could put where you're calling in from today, whether you want to put your home or where your office is, if you're in your office, just where you are in the state. And second, if you could just say a word about, what are the climate impacts you're seeing where you are in the state of Vermont? What's real for you? What's happening in your community that you sense is part of a changing climate? So if you could just take a moment in the chat, everybody here, I'd welcome you to do that. And just, where are you calling in from today, or where's home? And what are you seeing out there in terms of a changing climate that may be impacting your community? Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Jane. I'll just wait a moment, let folks type for a second. Right. Calais, more power outages. Bennington, Woodbury. Yep. I'm just reading the same way I hope you're reading. If folks are not familiar with Zoom for any reason, you get to that chat screen down at the bottom. It'll either say chat or click on the little three dots that say more, and one of those will be chat. And that'll open it up. And you can see what everybody's writing. And there's the obvious one, obviously, like there's some serious flooding that's happening in this state. Flooding, rain, Duxbury. Great. Okay. So thanks for doing that. I think it's just helpful for us all to see who's here, right? And where we're from, sort of physically in the state. And I want to get our brains thinking about climate and climate action as we get into this conversation. I will acknowledge that this is one of several types of conversations that the state is having and will be having around climate. And so we're trying to open up new spaces for a diverse range of folks to have a conversation about these issues. And we hope that today is like that. We'll drop in the chat now or later how to reach out to the Climate Action Office. And Sophie's going to be your best contact point. So she can drop her contact information in there, now and later, just so that it doesn't end here. Feel free to reach out to Sophie and do some follow-up. The first thing we're going to do is a presentation. And Jane, who's the director of the Climate Action Office, and one of the key folks there, Megan O'Toole, are going to share that presentation to talk about two things. One is how we got to where we are right now in this conversation about federal funding. And then Megan's going to talk even more specifically about the types of prioritization that's happening around this federal funding. And that's going to prompt us to jump into the conversation we want to have and use the bulk of our time together. It's going to take us to about the top of the hour to get through this presentation. So I will ask for your patience. Feel free to use the chat as a place to drop questions. If you're having questions as you're listening to Jane and Megan talk, the chat's a great place to do that. They may not be able to answer it in real time, but it's a good register of kind of questions that you might have about that presentation. All right, so I think that's it from me. I'll just say, let's do about 20, 25 minutes of presentation, get to the top of the hour, and then let's have a conversation about it. We actually have a little exercise to do as well online that should be interesting. So Jane, let me turn it over to you. And don't be surprised that Jane, when she speaks, it'll be like Sophie speaking because they're in the same room using Sophie's laptop as the audio. So don't be surprised about that. Jane, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you, everybody, for taking your Tuesday lunch hour to join us today. As David alluded to, we had a really productive conversation last night, and I'm feeling really energized to hear from you all today and share in this lunch hour with you all about the work that we're doing here at the Climate Action Office, how this fits in specifically to Vermont's climate goals and climate planning, and then turn it over to my colleague, Megan O'Toole, who leads our climate change mitigation work for our Climate Action Office, to really discuss the specific opportunity at hand today. And then as David continues to challenge us to meet our obligation to stay on task to deliver this presentation in 20 minutes or less, we really want to spend the rest of the time with all of you engaging around ideas and conversations and questions about where Vermont is going and how this federal resource can help us meet our goals. I am realizing I am sharing the wrong presentation, so I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. I'm really sorry, everyone. But we did this presentation for our Climate Council yesterday, and the presentation, do you have it open?
I do.
I'm going to have Sophie share it because she has it open on her computer. Good reason of being in the same room together. A little bit of the presentation we did for our Vermont Climate Council, which I'm about to tell you about on the next slide, was a little more detailed and dialed in around jargon than we want to use with all of you today. So as Sophie's presentation comes up, we'll move to the third slide and get us back on track. Next one. So sorry for that, everyone. But what I want to jump in with today before I turn it over to Megan is really to do some context setting around where Vermont is, where we're going with climate planning, and how this opportunity can help us meet our goals. For many of you, I hope you know, but Vermont passed what is a really rather ambitious climate law back in the fall of 2020. The meat of that law was really, it took what had been goals on the books for a number of years, actually more than a decade, around cutting climate pollution. It made those statutory requirements for us to meet, pretty much aligning us with global commitments around the Paris Climate Agreement, where we will cut our climate pollution in half by 2030, and then further cut it to 80% of where we were in 1990 by 2050. And while those are ambitious and challenging goals, this law did a lot more around setting direction and helping us obtain climate action around speaking to how we build resilience and adaptation into our built and natural environment, how we think about and protect our natural and working lands so that they could be there to both sequester and store carbon, but also build resilience in our natural and working lands, and how we invest in cross-cutting solutions like investing in our downtowns and compact settlements so that we can walk more, drive less, and protect the rural landscape around it. Those kinds of objectives are all spoken to in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And in meeting those objectives, the law looked to stand up what was the Vermont Climate Council, which is a separate body staffed by 8 administration officials, so leaders of the agencies that have a stake in pushing forward climate solutions, our Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, the Secretary of the Vermont Transportation Agency, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and all of those agencies that have the greatest stake in climate solutions, married with 15 legislative appointments who represent various sectors in the state, agriculture, forests, environmental communities, renewable energy. That council is staffed and governed to stand up the Climate Action Plan, which is really the roadmap that sets in forth the strategies and programs and actions to meet the objectives that I just spoke to in the Global Warming Solutions Act. Vermont had done climate planning in the past, but our initial climate action plan, which was adopted in December of 2021, really has this weight and authority behind it that helps us set a course to meet the requirements of the GWSA. It's intended to be iterative, and as we work on implementing it, we're constantly thinking about and involving and engaging with people like yourselves to think about how we can do better and how we can think about the strategies and solutions needed to meet the requirements of the law. That plan in 2021 made a recommendation to stand up a climate action office. And we were successful in putting that forward with the governor's budget in fiscal year 23. So that the state fiscal year starts on July 1st. And so our office is roughly about 16 months old. As David mentioned, Megan leads our mitigation work in that office, and Sophie, who's joining us today, also leads our community engagement and communications work, knowing that all of the programmatic work in our office is only as good as it is as we involve and work with all of you in helping set that work and that planning. The next plan will be adopted on July 1st of 2025 and every 4 years going forward. So it really is an iterative and a collaborative process that involves all Vermonters at this point. Next slide. There's a
delay.
It's a real delay on the slide. So the initial climate action plan, as I said, is really a roadmap for how the state can meet our aggressive climate action priorities. It really sets a series of strategies and programs in place to help us cut our climate pollution. First and foremost, 26% below 2005 levels by 2025, and then really much more aggressively to cut in half by 2030. As I mentioned, it has more than 230 actions that actually address those other objectives, including resilience and adaptation, as well as investing in our natural and working lands and other solutions that cut across all of those programmatic areas. It worked closely with our Just Transition Subcommittee to set the direction around the guiding principles and prioritize those most affected, so that as we put forward solutions and ideas, that we don't build upon bad systems in place, but really look to correct and steer programs and policies directed at those most impacted by the impacts of climate change. It set a policy and framework around decision making, and also set in motion a way for us to think about how we measure and track progress. All of this is built upon ongoing community engagement, and really is the way that we check back and think about the progress that we're making. Sorry, the delay is real. So this plan, which has been in place 2 years, is largely being implemented across state government. In thinking about the opportunities that have availed themselves through the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a federal legislation last summer around climate action, we really saw this as first an opportunity to review where progress had been made with the climate action plan, as well as think about additional programs and support across government that help support the actions put forward in the plan. So what is the programmatic work happening across state government that is in service of and complements the recommendations in the plan? We looked at developing a tracking and progress tool that looked at all of those actions and looked to coordinate with our partners across state agencies to think about where progress was being significantly made and where opportunities existed to direct funding towards to actually further advance our climate action. So what is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant? We're here today to talk about a unique opportunity. As I mentioned, it's a component of the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act was comprehensive climate legislation passed by the federal Congress about 14 months ago now. It included various other spending caps and healthcare reforms, which is why it's not called climate action legislation, but it really was the meat of it, was thinking about how the United States moved forward in cutting our climate pollution. And one of the most aggressive and largest pots, and I should say most flexible pots of money, is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants, which is what we're all here to talk about today. It's a one-time competitive process for $4.6 billion in federal funds. That funding is supported by a smaller planning grant that Vermont opted into last spring, $3 million that we have to support this planning work, these conversations with all of you. And the ideas that we'll be putting forward today will likely yield a competitive implementation grant application in April of this year that Vermont is likely to apply for roughly $90 million of that $4.6 billion pie. The eligible actions have to show a measurable reduction in climate pollution. So that can come in two ways. It can come in the way of us actually reducing the amount of emissions that we produce, or thinking about strategies that actually help us sequester and store those emissions. So thinking about how we protect more land, how we invest in our natural and working lands, and do more regenerative farming to actually store carbon emissions are also eligible. However, primary actions around adaptation and resilience that do not have those other co-benefits do not qualify for this fund. So we're thinking really about how we can maximize the funding that show measurable reductions in climate pollution, but knowing that Vermont needs to address all of these areas to comprehensively address climate change, we've been thinking a lot about how we lift up actions and measures that address a suite of these actions and have the co-benefits of all of them. And finally, before I turn it over to Megan, it's really good for us to all have the shared understanding of where Vermont's emissions come from. On the left side of this graph, what you'll see is our historical emissions. The data that we use to track this lags about 2 to 3 years behind. So our most current inventory, which was published last spring, is for 2020. It shows actually a decline in emissions between 2019 and 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. And that largest piece of the pie are transportation emissions. As a rural state, it takes a lot to move us around and think about how we get to places. Actually declined rather steeply between 2019 and 20, largely because of stay-at-home orders aligned with the pandemic. And so understanding where that stays and what kind of policies are lasting for impacts will be really important in thinking about how we meet our emissions reduction. Other sectors that are really meaningful in Vermont and have a long way to go in thinking about solutions is our buildings and thermal sector, how we heat our homes and commercial and industrial buildings. And our agricultural sector is actually that yellow sector, and actually is third in Vermont, about 16% of our emissions, and much larger than our electricity sector, which in other states tends to make up a larger proportional share of emissions. What you see on the right side of this graph is a projected forecast of where we need to go to meet the reduction requirements of the law. The Global Warming Solutions Act requires ambitious cuts, and as I mentioned, between now and 2030 will require either funding being directed at these areas and or significant policy intervention in order for us to meet our goals. With that, I'd love to turn it over to Megan for her to further articulate how we thought about application of these funds in meeting those goals. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So with that overview, I'm going to take the opportunity to just dive a little bit deeper into this particular funding opportunity that we have for Vermont and Vermonters to help to reduce climate change causing emissions. So as Jane mentioned, following the adoption of the Climate Action Plan, we have worked within the Climate Action Office with state and external partners to take a look at the actions that were adopted in the Climate Action Plan and do some further prioritization work of these actions to understand what would be ripe for this particular funding opportunity. So in the course of this review, we asked ourselves a series of questions related to these actions. So for a particular action, is there currently a lack of funding that would prevent that action from moving forward or being implemented? How would the action benefit Vermonters in an equitable way? So for example, we want to make sure that the climate change work that we're doing in Vermont benefits low income and disadvantaged communities and helps to lift them up as opposed to putting them in a less advantageous position or providing a disbenefit to those communities in some way. Does the action align with Vermont's Climate Action Plan? So understanding the charge and the work of the Climate Council in crafting the Climate Action Plan, how well does it fit within the overall structure and intent of the plan? And then finally, does the action help to reduce emissions that cause climate change? So as Jane mentioned, this particular funding opportunity is limited to measures and programs and policies that we can measure an actual reduction in climate change causing emissions. Next slide, please. So I'm about to go through some of the different buckets of climate action types that we reviewed in the Climate Action Office, as I said, within state government and with external partners and stakeholders that may be a good fit for this funding. But we definitely want to hear more from you about where you feel this list fits and aligns potentially with your priorities related to climate change funding. So first, before we understand where we need to go, we need to understand more about where funding is needed. We have a lot of federal resources and state resources available to address climate change. So we have to take a look at where current policies are being implemented to understand where additional work could be done with additional funding. So right now, we know that we are allocating significant resources to incentivizing consumers to purchase electric vehicles versus internal combustion or fossil fuel powered vehicles. This program is largely focused on passenger cars right now, so lighter cars. We don't currently have a program that incentivizes the purchase of medium or heavier duty vehicles that is available at the time that you purchase that vehicle. We also know that we have dedicated significant resources to helping individuals and businesses weatherize their homes and then switch away from heating their homes with fossil fuels to heating their homes with electricity. We know that cities and towns have access to a significant amount of funding via the Municipal Energy Resilience Program to help them assess the condition of their buildings and then apply for money to make improvements to those buildings to weatherize and fuel switch to make their infrastructure more climate friendly. We know that Vermont has the highest number per capita of public electric vehicle charging stations in the country, which is really significant. But we know that as that technology continues to make up more of the share of our transportation fleet, we're going to need even more public electric vehicle charging. And so we know that there's more to be done there. We've seen the federal government dedicate a significant amount of funding and resources to transitioning public transit and school buses to electric technology. So we know that there's a lot happening in that space. And then in Vermont, we know that there's been significant resources in some areas of the state dedicated to wetland restoration projects, and then also improving agricultural practices to be more climate friendly. But we know that more of that work could be done to allow more landowners and farmers to implement climate smart practices in the work that they do. Next slide, please. So knowing that there are a series of federal and state funding streams that are already flowing to help address climate change in Vermont, we need to consider this particular fund's unique place in meeting Vermont's needs in reducing climate change pollution. Current funding is coming to Vermonters in the form of tax credits, direct payments from the IRS, grant programs, no interest loans, and rebates. There are often many types of funding available for the same activity. So these funds can be combined, or we like to call stacked, to make an even bigger difference for folks that are looking to save money and reduce emissions. This particular funding opportunity is designed to be used by states to achieve their own specific goals. So this means we have an opportunity to personalize this funding for Vermont's needs and fill gaps that can't be met with existing resources. Therefore, we need to look at all sectors of the economy and ask more questions about how these funds can be most effective for Vermont and Vermonters. Next slide, please. So now we're going to dive into some of the sectors that we could look to add more resources to implement climate mitigation activities. Looking at the natural and working land sector, this is one of Vermont's best climate mitigation features. It's natural and working landscape, because natural and working lands have the ability to store and sequester carbon through the increase in farming practices that reduce and capture emissions, and then by conserving and managing land in such a way that enhances its climate benefits. Next slide, please. So we know that the transportation sector is our largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. So we know we have a lot of work to do in this space, but there has been, as I mentioned before, a lot of focus in incentivizing the adoption of electric technology for mobility. So Vermont is already leading the way towards transportation electrification through a variety of programs. But what about the used electric vehicle market? When consumers go to buy a car, they should be able to easily understand that choosing an EV can save them money right away, whether it's new or used, over the lifetime of the vehicle. But another big concern for EV drivers is how will they charge their car? If you don't own your home, or you rent your home, or you live in a multi-unit building, you need to understand and have certainty around the ability to charge your vehicle at home, because we know that the ability to charge your vehicle at home really contributes to that lifetime savings of owning an electric vehicle versus a fossil fuel powered car. So I also talked about medium and heavy duty trucks, or heavy diesel trucks. If a large fleet operator is going to have to consider more than just the purchase price difference between a fossil fuel truck and an electric truck. So should we adopt an incentive program that makes the price of the vehicle lower, but should we also make available training opportunities to fleet owners and service providers? Also, what about any significant infrastructure changes that fleet owners need to account for when transitioning to electric technology? What sort of charging do they need on site, and what other types of infrastructure will they need to make sure that they can successfully own and operate a heavy electric truck? Next slide, please. So the buildings and heating sector is our second largest contributor to emissions, as Jane reviewed. And we know that there's a lot of money currently available to make changes related to this sector. So how do we make sure that people can access these programs? How do we make sure that homeowners and renters can avail themselves of these resources, whether they are making a plan change to their living space or they are responding to an emergency? We saw with the flooding over the summer that a lot of folks suffered losses of their heating and cooling infrastructure in their homes. And so they needed to replace those systems right away. So we need to be able to have energy coaching available that not only helps folks make plan changes, but also emergency changes, and takes advantage of new technology in making those more emergency-based decisions. Also, how do we make sure that we don't run out of money to continue these important programs that can really make a difference in cost savings and emissions to Vermonters? And finally, understanding that cities and towns have a great need in addressing, older and out-of-date infrastructure. How do we give them sufficient funding to make sure that they can meet all of their energy improvement goals within their town-owned infrastructure and buildings? Next slide, please. Finally, focusing on the solid waste sector, the big question here is how, as Vermonters, can we consume less? Because the more that we waste and the more that we throw away, the more emissions that we cause, because we know that the more waste that we produce, the more emissions that are caused by this waste disposal activity. So can we help, for example, materials management facilities make process changes that will allow them to recycle more material? Can we help schools and institutions compost more by giving them the tools and infrastructure that they need to do that, but then also providing them with the educational and training resources that they need to use that infrastructure? Also, what about appliances that have harmful high greenhouse gas emitting emissions? How do we make sure that these systems and appliances aren't emitting potent climate change causing gases, either during their operation or when they're being disposed of at the end of their life? Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about some ideas and opportunities across these 4 key sectors in Vermont. And so here are some examples of specific programs that could help kind of answer these questions with this particular funding opportunity. And just kind of focusing on one in each space right now, knowing that we need to give farmers and forest landowners additional tools to reduce and capture emissions, how can we make sure that they have access to funding sources that may already exist to take advantage of those opportunities? So how do we lend more capacity to those existing programs to make those changes? In the transportation sector, How do we focus on housing development or redevelopment that allows us to travel less or use public transit more? In the buildings and heating space, how do we create a robust thermal energy coaching network that allows individuals and businesses to easily navigate the multiple funding sources that are currently available to make those changes, and make sure that the funding is available in a way that benefits the recipient of the funding, and also the contractor that is helping implement those changes on behalf of the individual. And in the solid waste sector, again, how do we consume less and therefore waste less? Because we know that that has a huge impact on our emissions in Vermont. And what kind of tools and infrastructure can we put in place at the point where the material is being used, or the point where the material is actually intended to be recycled or disposed of in such a way that reduces those end of life emissions? So now that we've really dug into the details of the funding, I'm going to turn it back over to David to hear from you and get some feedback about what the best opportunity is to use this funding. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Jane. So that was an overview of why we're having the conversation, and then some of the specificity that the state's working on right now as it's trying to put together this funding proposal for the federal money. We wanted to just take a little time. First, if there's clarifying questions that folks have about that presentation and about what the state's planning on doing, we can do some of that. Then we wanted to ask you a question about how this can be particularly meaningful in your community and for you. I'm going to leave this slide up just for 1 second and then we'll drop it. But, are there clarifying questions and that folks have? I've seen a few things come across in the chat, but are there things that folks would just need to clarify right out of the gate here to help understand what's going on? Any quick feedback that you have for Megan or for Jane in what they presented? Anything on top of your mind right now? I see someone come off mute. Deborah, hi.
Hi. Well, I would like to know how this initiative would be coordinated with something like the proposed bill before the legislature, the Vermont Superfund Climate Bill. Because although this is an exciting opportunity, I keep thinking that ultimately this is funded by taxpayer money, whereas something like the Superfund Climate Bill is holding the fossil fuel industries accountable for their share of the climate damage. And now with attribution science, it's possible to actually determine the actual amount of damage that can be attributable to these fossil fuel companies. But so that's one reason. One thing is, if the Climate Action Committee is working with the legislature to avoid duplication, and then also with the awareness that there is a lawsuit in the works, which could potentially create a big pot of money. So
Thanks, Deborah. Can we take those right now? And then if you've got more stuff, we'll jump back to that.
Sure.
Is that all right?
Sure.
Yes. I love those questions. Maybe we'll drop the slides for 1 second. We might put them back up, but just so we can see each other for a sec. So the questions about the coordination with other activity that's happening, particularly activity that may generate funds that aren't taxpayer funds. Jane or others, is there something to say about that, sort of how all these different puzzle pieces fit together?
Yeah, I guess, at the Climate Action Office is uniquely positioned to think about the role across government and how we think about where funding opportunities are most needed. So as Megan and I both discussed in putting forward the actions and measures proposed here today, that's been done in deep coordination with other state agencies around thinking about what the opportunities are that we currently have in front of us. So what are all the different federal funding streams coming into the state, as well as other opportunities through fiscal year 24 budget opportunities in Vermont and beyond, to make sure that we're amplifying that funding opportunity and marrying it with this specific one that is not dissimilar from any larger funding source that may or may not become available in the future. So certainly hear you on that. And the final just component I'll speak to around this upcoming legislative session and thinking about climate financing and spending more broadly long-term, whether it's through the bill that you mentioned, Deborah, or whether it's through other opportunities, is the Treasurer's Office in Vermont has been tasked with thinking and putting forward a recommendation to the legislature around what is needed around coordination or an entity to think about the role of both government and then the role of like the fiscal agents we have in our state, like the Vermont Bond Bank, Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and others who are really good at deploying funds for Vermonters. So it'll be interesting to see what the Treasurer's Office recommends so that long-term, that coordination is ensured. And what we really see the value being around the state government, which is priority setting about how those dollars are spent, and then thinking about how to share that with the entities who are best at deploying those funds. So appreciate that there's lots of moving pieces. Our office for now has been playing that role of coordination and supporting to make sure that we're using resources in the most responsible way. But long-term, I think thinking about that structure will be really important, especially if new and huge resources become available.
Thank you.
Thanks. Whatever.
Great. Are there other follow-up sort of quick reactions? And then I'm going to have you do a little exercise, but is there any quick reactions? I'm seeing things in the chat. Kat just mentions, I'm interested in learning about funding for food waste reduction and community scale composting to help support the implementation of Act 148. Others talk about charging stations and how to make them better. Others are talking about, can we fund community-owned solar arrays in connection with community resilience centers, right? So there's some good stuff happening in the chat. Does anybody want to verbalize anything before we dive into a more specific exercise? Sam, go ahead, please.
Thanks. I'm Sam Lashley-Hurst, Climate and Energy Planner at Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. I just wanted to ask a quick question. Totally understand the focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering, and then there being able to be other co-benefits. But I also wanted to sort of get at the capacity problem or capacity issue that I think a lot of people are facing, and wanted to know if like local capacity for grant writing and management, or like revolving loan funds, or other kind of like programs that will take on some of the administrative burden so that we can draw down those federal funds specifically for those greenhouse gas emissions reductions projects would also be included. Like, if that, can we suggest those kinds of things, or is that one too many removed?
No, I mean, and Megan might, I'll let Megan follow up and speak about specific opportunities that we've been harnessing through these funds and thinking about specifically. But I will say that we have a lot of flexibility with these funds to actually fund the capacity that goes along with the programmatic ideas. And so we're thinking about, as we put forward the implementation grant, what the capacity needs are for whoever the state agency or entity is that we're funneling those funds ultimately to. So that's an opportunity, and one that we've already been thinking about with that smaller $3 million pot we have with RPCs and others that I'm happy to have Megan talk about if that's of interest.
Megan, is there additional detail about that would be helpful to share right now?
Yeah, I mean, I just highlight again that that is a comment that we've received a lot, Sam, and I know you and I have talked about this too, and it's you know, I'm on the select board at a municipality myself, and so I completely understand the burden that these folks are facing and the capacity shortages to do this work. And so I think our our goal is that while we're still looking for ideas for existing opportunities that we can tap into, we have a focus on some existing pathways to build capacity in municipalities and increase funding, understanding that creating yet another opportunity just kind of tugs at those capacity issues. And so really trying to utilize existing structures that municipalities are already participating in to just give them additional resources via those pathways. But if there are paths that we are not immediately seeing, we really would appreciate that feedback from towns and regions. So thanks for asking that, Sam.
That's great. I see another Sam. Samantha, go ahead.
Hello, I have a question on really, sorry, I had the question and then I lost it, I apologize.
Okay.
But I wanted to bring a point that a lot of towns do not have an extensive amount of available budget. So when we find a lot of these funding opportunities, it usually require some kind of match or some large participation that wasn't planned when the original budget is happening. So let's just say there was an announcement for funding during July, already the fiscal year's budget has already been planned for. There's no way to appropriate matches in order to get this funding, so therefore they don't go after the funding. Has there been any thoughts about trying to put together a plan of when something is going to be announced, giving a heads up yearly or before budgets are out there to work with the community and understand what kind of match they need, where they could get that match, and give them a little bit of time to work on those to go after that funding?
Samantha, I love the question. Jane or
Yeah, so as
Megan?
Megan put it in the chat, there's actually no match required for this funding, so it's 100% funding for the project at hand. I will say what we haven't spoken to is the time horizon. So that once we apply for the implementation grant, we expect to receive it in the fall of next year, and we'll have 5 years to spend it. And one of the ways that we've been thinking about capacitizing and supporting municipal level action is through an extended grant that would go to RPCs to actually have those funds for a prolonged period of time to make them available for municipalities to advance priority recommendations from energy plans, so that if you're not eligible or don't have time or capacity to apply the first year, there's some anticipation of that funding being around for a number of years. So we're working closely with RPCs to think about what their needs are to make the funding available to you all, and thinking about how to really elevate and support actions at municipal level.
Thank you. One other thing that you guys might want to mention, because there's a lot of comments on charging of electric vehicles, maybe discuss the NEVI program with everyone quickly about how that's rolling out.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah,
fine.
so I think that falls into the category of, where are resources currently flowing, and so how can we utilize this opportunity to capitalize on those existing resources or complement them in some way. So the NEVI program is a federally funded electric vehicle charging program, public charging. Vermont is participating in that program. We're receiving money from the federal government to implement a robust plan to build even more public charging stations. With this additional fund, there's also a related community charging grant program associated with that funding source. And so we're also applying for additional charging stations under that program. So given that level of resources is being dedicated to a huge increase in public charging availability with that fund, we are potentially looking at the other areas where charging is needed, like for example, at multi-unit dwellings and at rental housing, where it can be more challenging to figure out how to really take advantage of those cost savings associated with owning an electric vehicle and charging your vehicle at home. We have a pilot program that's being operated by the state to build those charging opportunities right now. And so we'd be looking to expand that existing program, knowing that there are no federal sources of funding available for that type of focused multi-unit dwelling and also workplace charging as well.
Thanks, Megan. That's really helpful. Let's do 2 more comments, and then I have a little exercise to do that I think will be hopefully fun and helpful to really tease out what's important. Michael, you're up next.
Thank you. I've got a couple of quick ones. One, I noticed there wasn't any consideration mentioned on the energy plan moving forward in those initial columns, and I was curious if the Climate Action Office was considering opening up some public comment on the working lands protection capacity that we could possibly level, similar to the study that Mass Audubon did, where we could identify some brownfield areas, rooftop solar, et cetera, to try and take some of the pressure off of working lands for energy development. It's an issue that has come up quite a lot down here in Bennington County. And I was a little surprised that that wasn't part of this application. And on the working lands front, we have a lot of good luck with microgrants. So would really encourage the agency exploring how to develop more microgrants similar to the American Farmland Trust microgrant that just closed out. Other than that, interesting.
Thanks, Michael. Nice points. Just as we don't need to go deep in this, but the question about identifying appropriate land or brownfield or other lands for solar, is that part of this story and this funding? No, I see Jane.
So, yeah, there's another source of funding that's been called Solar for All that is under a different pot of money associated with the Inflation Reduction Act, but within, and I'm just going to be throwing all sorts of funding sources at your way right now, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is where that solar opportunity lives. And the Public Service Department just applied for Vermont's share of that funding, and we'll hear about that application early next year. So we're hoping for really significant opportunities via the Solar for All program related to community solar in particular. And of course, siting will be a large component of that program. So that's a great point. Thank you.
Great. Okay. And just noting that microgrants point is an input from Michael. Peter, let's go to your hand and then let's do something else for a second. Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about scale and time. So far, the discussion has been really about funding programs that are nibble around the edges of business as usual. And we've had that for 3 decades now, and it's not getting us where we need to get. More electric cars are just more cars. For example, they're cars on the road consuming space and causing traffic fatalities. It's just imagine if you had all the money in the world to pursue the projects and the programs that have so far been mentioned, would we end up where we need to be? And I think that the short answer is no. So I want to encourage, in the brief time that there is for action, that we not try to continue to put patches on business as usual, and instead go for activities that are consistent with a climate safe culture and economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. That's a nice segue to where I want to go, which Sophie's going to drop something in the chat. It's a link to a Mentimeter poll. In that Mentimeter poll, if you click on it now, it's going to show you a question. And that question asks, it's a little bit wordy, but hopefully it makes sense. It's essentially saying, what does the state need? And when I say the state, I mean the Climate Action Office and other people in state government. What does the Climate Action Office need to hear right now to ensure that this funding that will end up, hopefully in Vermont, will be meaningful in the community, right? And Peter's point about really focusing on actions that are at the scale of the climate crisis. You may have other things. A lot of interesting things have been said in the chat. I'd encourage you to type those in here as well. And as you type them in, I'll start to share my screen as they come in. So think about it for a second and then type up, this would make it truly meaningful, right? And I just want to pause on this. It'll be quiet for a moment while we're doing this. If anybody's having a hard time clicking on that link or making it work for themselves, just let me know and I'll try to problem solve with you. But let's just take a moment, look at that link in the chat that was just dropped in. Sophie dropped it in. Go ahead and answer that question. Think about it for a sec. Once I see a bunch come in, I'll share my screen. I'm starting to see things come in. Thanks, everybody. I'll share in just a sec. In the meantime, a quick shout out to Chris Campany. Good to see you, Chris. Keep your eyes on the road. It's all good. All right. I'm seeing some stuff come in. Let's share this. Folks seeing my screen? I encourage folks to read. That's what I'm doing right now, is just reading what's on the screen. Then we can shout out about some of the things we're seeing. So I'm enjoying reading this, and I'll keep scrolling as we go. What's going to happen in just a moment is when I press enter, it'll give you all the chance to pick 3 of these that feel particularly meaningful for you, in addition to what you wrote. But 3 of these that you're reading, select them. We call it voting. It's not really voting. We're not actually voting on anything right now. Like, I'll caveat this tremendously. This is not about picking winners right now or voting anybody off the island. It's just trying to get a sense of the room of those of you who came today to this conversation. What is, what's energizing for you? Where is your heart and soul right now when you think about these opportunities? So I'll hit enter in just a second. And then if you go right back to that same page where you entered this in, you'll be able to pick 3 of them that your fellow Vermonters put in, and say, yep, I feel like this is really good too. There's definitely some themes as I look across this around equity and meaningful for all socioeconomic levels, looking deeply at what's meaningful for rural areas. There's a lot of focus around making this work for the full range of Vermonters. I'm going to press enter now, and that'll allow you to go back to that page and select 3 that really feel representative of your thinking as well. All right, here we go. I'll stop sharing. You should be able to go back to that page. And among all those things we just saw, just select 3 that say, yep, absolutely. This feels right on. Let's give it a moment so you get a chance to do that. Let me know if it's not working for some reason. Sometimes the tech is challenging. Excellent. I'm seeing it come in. I'm just going to give it a little longer. I can't share my screen with the results until folks are finished. I'll cut it off by accident if I start sharing results. Excellent. I think we're almost there. Just again, to reiterate, we are not doing hard science here, folks. We are just taking the temperature of the room, and we're not going to use this for anything more than what it is, which is you all taking the temperature of the room, of who's here and what's meaningful for you. I'll give it just a second more. Take that last minute to select a few that feel representative of your thoughts. All right, I think we're there. Last chance. Oh, numbers keep going up, so I'm pausing in my last chance. All right. I'll just share my screen again with all the caveats we need to do. All right, let's look at this together. What do we got? Some of the ones that are among the most motivating for you all are around thinking thoughtfully on co-benefits and aligning with community needs. And a specific shout out to denser, affordable, multi-use housing, viable public transit. All right, so the federal government's saying we need measurable emissions reductions, and you're saying, and we want to do that with maximum co-benefits and aligning with community needs. Okay, great. Again, inclusive low and moderate income folks, environmental justice communities, great. Regional approaches to outcomes, investment in people do the work with communities. Again, these are really talking to each other across the top here. Improving thermal in people's homes, most tangible, direct way to improve lives, get them involved in climate action. Thermal is a much lower hanging fruit than transportation, right? So thermal being fuel switching, getting heat pumps in the house, getting weatherization going, great. And public transportation, right? Let's think about this. This is a similar one here about thinking thoughtfully how this impacts the full range of Vermonters. Interesting, this one about resiliency. Vermont knows a little bit about storms and being prepared for storms. Okay, and there's more, right? There is more and more. And I'll share this as a summary for everyone. I'm curious, as you all are looking at this, what's jumping out at you? Like, what is this telling us about the priorities of folks who are in this room? What do folks want to say about that? Let me just pause. What is this saying about the themes that are emerging? Anyone want to take a stab at that? let me ask Jane and Megan, what are you seeing? Oh, Kat, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
I was looking for the button.
Yeah.
It looks to me like we're saying, trust the people in our communities doing the work and fund what they're already doing, because we have brilliant people all over our state doing really good work. So that's one theme. And the other that I see is to really focus on the bottom part of our population that often gets overlooked. And I'll just also plug that that's often where the best ideas are seated, is in the communities that struggle every single day.
Nice. Love that summary, Kat. By the way, there's a shout out to you in this. Did you see that?
I did see that. That's very sweet.
Okay. Other reactions. What else are people seeing? I'd be interested in, does Kat's summary feel, oh, Kashka, go ahead. Yeah, please.
That there are quite a few gaps, and this funding could really help fill in some of those gaps. There's quite a few gaps that exist all across Vermont.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Kashka. Great.
See a lot of different approaches to how to support reducing demand from the thermal sector and focusing on people's homes, which could really affect a broad swath of Vermonters, including those most energy burdened, or however you want to quantify it.
Mhm.
So I see a lot, like quite a few of these were kind of in the same vein around in that regard, which I think is also going to contribute to the resiliency and reliability of our electrical infrastructure. So.
Yeah, nice. And for those who don't know the phrase energy burdened, Sam, you're talking about, you can talk about it, the percentage of your income that has to go to energy, heating your home, other sources of energy. Yeah.
Well, I see a desire to have some synergy, particularly between towns. So instead of having 10 little minor projects or whatever, particularly because of funding, that there's some more regional or across towns, and also the synergy across income wealth gaps.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Thanks for that. Yeah. Other things, Deborah, looks like you come off mute.
Hi. Well, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but it really has occurred to me that the fact that this money could be received in a short-term way is really key. I don't know how many people realize the dire financial situation that Montpelier is in right now. I mean, it's we're facing big budget cuts, and between the total lack of economic activity in our town for so many months, and the fact that there were tax abatements offered to businesses, it's just jaw-dropping, the financial situation that we're in. So I'm all about long-term solutions, and I've actually proposed them, and I don't know how much of this funding would be ineligible, but I just have to say, we are in a dire financial situation, and I'm sure other towns are, but Montpelier maybe especially so. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Yeah. I'm seeing something in the chat that is very interesting and specific, and a word that I do not use in my daily life. Vermiculite, or help me pronounce that correctly. Jennifer, do you want to say a bit more about that? Jane's shaking her head like, yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Jennifer Green from Burlington Electric Department in Burlington. And I don't know about the extent to which vermiculite was used as an insulation in other homes around the state, but in Chittenden County and in Burlington specifically, we have a lot of houses with vermiculite in the attic. And this is, it was mined, and there is a likelihood, but a small likelihood, that there's asbestos in that vermiculite. And so if a weatherization contractor comes to your house, 10% of homes. Oh, thanks, Gabrielle. If a weatherization contractor comes to your house and sees their vermiculite, they say, well, as soon as you can get that remediated, we'll come back and talk. And the cost to remediation is prohibitively high. And I think it stops a lot of folks in their tracks.
That's interesting. I wonder, for those of you, whether Jane or Megan or others, is this on your radar now in the existing programs or future programs? Chris has a thumbs up on that. Yeah.
So I don't know that I can speak to specifically how this might fit into existing programs, but I do think that this is in line with our thinking related to making funding more accessible to people in a way that helps them navigate these types of challenges, whether it's from a kind of like an existing condition point of view, or whether it's ensuring that after improvements are made, that the indoor air quality of the structure can be either maintained or improved. So kind of looking at those peripheral issues that definitely impact the ability to get this work done, and then for it to actually be effective and healthy when it's in place, is definitely a consideration that we're applying to this funding opportunity.
Thanks, Megan. So in the chat, there's some additional clarity, like this is potentially sort of environmental justice issue, I guess, looking at the housing stock and who might be most affected by this. Interesting. What else do we need to talk about right now? Like, what hasn't been said? What's an area? I see a hand. Go right ahead. Who is that? Gabrielle.
I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand electronically. So I'm the executive director of an organization that focuses on grants for low and moderate income Vermonters' energy needs. And one of the things that is almost a truism throughout that work is that it takes much more money, much more resources to help low and moderate income households per project than it does for non-income qualified households. And so that is something that, in the discussion of equitability, equitable and equal are not the same thing. So whatever funding structures you're contemplating and whatever projects you're contemplating, you have to build into it that the work for a low and moderate income home, and I saw this in the comment, that financing is not the same as incentives for a low and moderate income home, because there's an aversion to financing. So that's another example of where equitable instead of equal will affect how funding should be allocated towards, low and moderate income projects per se, and non-income qualified projects. So that's what I wanted to share.
That's really helpful, Gabrielle. Thanks. Yeah. Samantha?
Sorry to drive this point home. I've mentioned it a few times, but one of the things that I feel strongly about is, our waste footprint as a pollution adder, I guess you could say. And I have been in Vermont for a while now and noticed that our waste, our disposal of waste is not something that is well done. I find a lot of homes or residents are allowed to, park or use their home and their land as a dumping ground. Even on my road, I took a walk and I discovered someone drove by and dumped a washing machine, and it goes through water, runoff water, which then goes to a river, which then flows down down the mountain to another river and there, so on and so on. And so I'm finding that, we have this issue with brownfields, but it's become a residential issue as well. And I do not know if it's related to, the lack of locations where you can dispose of things, or is it, the cost of disposing it, or is it really, some people are, prone to keeping things. I don't want to call them hoarders, but it's pretty close to it sometimes. And so is that something, we're concerned about because it does affect the environment? Our water sources are being contaminated by waste from a lot of these abandoned vehicles and appliances. And I feel like that is another way we can approach the pollution that we see. And that, again, I think that's another thing that we need to look at is how towns fund disposal.
Thanks, Samantha.
Thank you.
That seems to be part of the story that Megan was saying in the sort of waste story. One of those 4 big buckets. Other thoughts that people have that maybe you haven't been able to share yet through the chat or through verbally. What else do we need to say here? I'm looking at some of the chat things as well. Indoor air quality in municipal buildings. And residential buildings. Another funding gap would be funding for property owners to make improvements required by new national fire code to obtain a permit for EV chargers and enclosed spaces. Did not know about that. Kat, go ahead.
I just wanted to put in a plug for stacking functions and multi-solving. I think that we have an opportunity to find those issues and things that we can fund, hopefully that are already existing initiatives from all the good people around the state already doing work, but to think about those things that can actually change multiple things with one action. And because I'm in the food waste realm, I'll just mention that, not just to plug my project, but I think there are a lot of projects out there. When we reduce food waste, we actually address, I think it's the 4th thing listed in the drawdown book. So we're reducing food waste, and when we're composting that food waste, additionally, we're also increasing soil health. We're potentially helping to mitigate flooding. We're building resilience in communities. We're building skills. We're reducing the extractive economy around our waste culture that ships stuff all over the place, combines it with plastics and PFAS, et cetera. So just thinking about multi-solving and stacking functions, no matter what's chosen, with also impacts to the environmental justice communities all around our state.
Thanks, Kat. Really appreciate that. Great. I saw a hand from Michael, but then it went down. Michael, jump in if there's something else you want to say.
Just real briefly, I guess. I do a lot of work in the working land space, and something just to mildly plug is there are a pretty comprehensive suite of land management techniques, including some pasture renovations utilizing deep-rooted forbs that have been developed relatively recently that are in some need of support. The transition to the management methodology is pretty intensive, but the end result is a pretty significant drawdown in carbon from soil carbon formation, and also a reduction in enteric methane production resulting from increased tannin volume in the feed from the forbs. So there's a lot of these working lands incentives that could be worked into this type of funding that could do exactly what Kat says, build that stacking function on working lands that we at the local level are having a hard time getting funding for because it's a pretty comprehensive and expensive proposition.
Thanks, Michael. And I think I encourage you to be in touch with the Climate Action Office and vice versa, because it sounds like, you know, the Climate Action Office wants to go out and have some conversations with farmers. And we should talk about that and how to have these conversations. Chris, go ahead.
Hey, David, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm calling in from Vermont Passive House, a nonprofit that promotes the Passive House standard in Vermont.
Mhm.
And boy, I've heard so many good climate action, sustainability, resilience comments here. But I want to point out that if we're going to close the tap on fuel oil and propane and natural gas in Vermont, our new construction needs to have deep reductions in electric demand. We have to step up our code upgrades in Vermont, our energy code upgrades, and include Passive House standard as a target standard for health, ventilation, energy demand in buildings. Cooling demand is going to be an extremely high stress on our renewable electric grid. And if we're going to make the electric grid, our new and growing electric grid, work in Vermont, we have to have deep reductions in electric use in buildings. Also, we're going to see a step up of electric demand for transportation. This is crucial, and it ties into indoor health and comfort. It ties into resiliency and sustainability for buildings. We spend in Vermont, it's a tremendous amount of our time indoors. Anyway, I just, if there's federal stream of money coming through, I suggest that it be, our existing building stock is extremely energy wasteful. So retrofitting and holding new construction industry to a higher standard. There's some developers in Chittenden County that are still delivering Energy Star projects. Passive House standard brings energy demands down to the lowest level. That's how we're going to partner with a renewable grid. And it ties into all other sectors of our lives here in Vermont. Just wanted to put a plug for that. And I've heard so many good climate action sectors and suggestions here as well. So I'm curious to see what other people think about that. Just one more thing. The energy code's been upgraded in Vermont every 3 years, and it's been going deeper, but by baby steps. We only have 8 years left to really make an impact. And we have no way of enforcing energy code in the residential sector because we don't have contractor licensure and a mandatory registry. Vermont needs a state of Vermont public building office like Massachusetts, Maine, Connecticut, like all the states around us. Just wanted to put in a plug for that. I understand that state funding is extremely stressed. Hey.
Thanks,
Done.
Chris. That's great. I really appreciate you bringing that up in the real life experience of being able to build homes to a passive house standard. Great. So I know there's a question in the chat. So now what? So I think as we're getting to the top of the hour here, I think, Jane, you had one more slide that talks about next steps. Is that right? I think, why don't we go to that and then talk about what to expect from the Climate Action Office in the coming months on these issues.
Thanks, David. So we touched on some of this throughout today's presentation and discussion, but just to put a finer point on it, today's discussion was part of a limited number of meetings that we're holding right now, but it's part of a larger plan around community engagement as we move forward in drafting our implementation grant that's due not till April 1st of this year. The first deliverable is the plan, which is due only about a month before the implementation grant. And that plan is lifting up the ideas that we're hearing from all of you today, along with the ideas that we've worked on in building collaboratively with our other partners across state government. We hope to have that initial plan available in February for folks to comment on, and through registration today and your feedback, we plan to share a link to that for all folks who have engaged with us over the winter to comment on or ask questions about, and we'll likely hold some additional meetings then prior to the submittal of that plan in March. More specifically, our feedback this winter will be targeted, as David mentioned, so around the sectors that we're trying to lift up ideas around. So ideas that Michael and others have shared with us around how to reach farmers and others we look forward to speaking with you further about, so that we're heading out and meeting people where they are to make sure that we're hearing from the voices that will largely be most impacted and benefited from these opportunities. And in final, if we are awarded the funding, we'll likely have that decision made around the summer, July 1st of next year, with the funds rolling into Vermont bank accounts around October of next year, with access and availability for 5 years. And so we're looking forward to continuing the conversation and thinking about how we can make those funds most meaningful to communities around the state.
Great. Thanks, Jane. And also, we'll be creating a meeting summary from this meeting and last night. And we're happy to send that to all of you, since when you registered to this Zoom, we got your email and we can send that out. And so you can help us make sure we're capturing what we said today as appropriately as possible. There's one other thing we want to do before we go, and that is Sophie has a little demographics survey. It's just about 5 questions, I think, Sophie, or something like that. And we're trying to keep track of sort of who we're talking with and where they're from and the diversity of those voices. And so Sophie will drop it in the chat now, I think, or we'll send it out as an email afterwards. If you wouldn't mind, it's anonymous. You don't put your name on there. Just, we're interested in sort of the range of folks that we're reaching. And so we have that small demographic survey. And I'm not going to speak to the quality of the Otter thing that's posting automatically right now. I'm not a big fan of the Otter summaries, so I'll just put that out there. So I want to thank everybody for spending an hour and a half today and sharing some really thoughtful feedback. Like last night, it was a fantastic conversation that really got to some core pieces of information that only you have. And that's why we're trying to do these conversations. Please reach out to Sophie, to Jane, to Megan, and others if you have additional thoughts. Sophie, it's listed as Climate Action Office there, but so Sophie dropped in the chat that demographic survey. And do fill that out if you get a moment. It just helps us know who we're talking to, and more importantly, who we might not be talking to. So with that, let's close up today's meeting. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate that you came. And this won't be the last time you hear from the Climate Action Office. And please, make your voice heard as well, reaching out to them. Thanks, everyone. With that, we'll close it up. Take care. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks for
Take
being
care,
here.
everybody.